So we're dealing with one of the most fundamental sugyas in Hilchos Shabbos. Fascinating sugya, and a very well-known machlokes between Gedolei HaRishonim. Pshat in the Gemara, Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph, Ovid Ba'ared Bechavrei. So I assume I don't need to teach you Pshat. You probably delve into the amkus of the sugya. I just want to share with you my mahalach in Psik רישא דלניח עלי בביור machlokes achinuch v'hatosfos. So most of the Rishonim disagree with the Sefer Chinuch, not the Chinuch, the Aruch. Most of the Rishonim disagree with the Aruch, but the shit of the Aruch is Psik רישא דלניח עלי is mutar, goes back to the fundamental concept of davar she'einoi mischaven. To understand Psik רישא דלניח עלי, we need to understand the concept of Psik רישא. But we can't understand the concept of Psik רישא until we understand the concept of davar she'einoi mischaven. What is the machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon? Davar she'einoi mischaven mutar, kishitas Reb Shimon, or davar she'einoi mischaven chayiv, kishitas Reb Yehuda. So our last year was about Maleches Machshavos. And in the Shir of Maleches Machshavos, I brought shittas HaTosfos that davar she'einoi mischaven b'Shabbos, even according to Reb Yehuda, is not an Issa D'Oraisa because it's not Maleches Machshavos. But the machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon is not about Hilchos Shabbos. It is a machlokes regarding all the law in Shabbat Torah. Zvochim Tzaddik Aleph, we find this machlokes l'gabe the Issa D'Oraisa kibui eish shal gabi hamizbeach, eish shal merocha. Shabbos Yud Aleph, we find the machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon regarding the Issa Sirus. So the machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon is not a machlokes in Hilchos Shabbos. They have a separate machlokes in Hilchos Shabbos, whether it's Maleches Machshavos or not. But the Yesodis, like a machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon, refers to all the Isurim Shabbat Torah. Halacha Reb Shimon davar she'einoi mischaven mutar. But this is a very fundamental and fascinating question. Why is davar she'einoi mischaven mutar according to Reb Shimon? So the Yesodis like a machlokes nowhere in Shas Bavli or Yerushalmi do we find an explanation. Why is davar she'einoi mischaven mutar? And why don't Chazal care to share with us, to explain with us what's the heter of davar she'einoi mischaven? Not only is it found nowhere in Bavli or Yerushalmi, I dare to say none of the Rishonim explain why davar she'einoi mischaven is mutar. And many times I teach my Talmidim, this is an awesome question. So the machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon is found many times in Shas. How do we understand the fact that neither Bavli nor Yerushalmi nor any of the Rishonim don't care to teach us what is the shit of Reb Shimon? Why is davar she'einoi mischaven mutar? Rashi, 300 Malei Tosfos, the Ramban, the Rashba, Gedolei Talmideim, the Ritva, the Ran, the Rosh, all the Rishonim, nobody cares to explain to us why davar she'einoi mischaven is mutar. So whenever we have a question like this, the reasoning must be, Hoyo ze kol kach poshut be'einayim, didn't occur to them that this is something that needs to be explained. To them, it was so poshut. Do we need to teach you olive base? But to us, it's not poshut at all. But that's the only explanation. Why wouldn't Rashi and Tosfos and all the others care to to open our eyes and to teach us and to explain what's the shit of Reb Shimon? Why is the Hashem Schara Mutar? I have a very similar question regarding another machlokes, which is not a machlokes to Noam, but rather a machlokes to Meron, but it is also such a fundamental sugya. And this sugya deals not with laving, like Dov Hashem Eschaven, but rather with mitzvahs to say. The machlokes that we find Rosh Hashanah Chav Chesed Beis and many other sources in Shas. Mitzvah Sichas Kavod. What is the machlokes? Rava and Rav Zera. Halacha, Mitzvah Sichas Kavod. Kach nifsek b'sinas. I think at one of the Archikalas I gave a shir about Mitzvah Sichas Kavod, and he asked the same question. This machlokes is found in many sources, Bavli and Yerushalmi. Nowhere in Bavli, nowhere in Yerushalmi. None of the Rishonim explain why mitzvah srichas kavona. What is the machlokes? So my response and explanation to these fundamental questions is Gedolei Atanoim Reb Yehuda Reb Shimon Lagabe Dov Hashem Eschaven Gedolei Ameroyim Rav Zera Rava Lagabe mitzvah srichas kavona. The machlokes is in the very nature and the very essence of Maseh HaOdam, the nature and essence of Maseh HaMitzvahs. And because in the eyes of the Rishonim, so Poshut, they didn't see a need or a reason to explain. So regarding Mitzvah Sichas Kavana, the machlokes is, what is the nature of mitzvahs? Is it enough to perform a mitzvah? To be Yotzi Yedei Chayva? Everybody agrees that the proper way to do a mitzvah is far beyond mitzvah sichas kavana. It needs to be lishma, l'shem shemayim, bilti l'shem levadai, without any pnias. But that is l'chatchila. What is the minimum that is required? A person should be Yotzi Yedei Chayva. Is it necessary that the person is aware that he's Makayim a mitzvah? So the machlokes mitzvah sichas kavod is not about exeris kosev. It's about the most fundamental interpretation of what is a mitzvah. Is it necessary that a person is aware that he has intention to be Makayim a mitzvah, to be Yotzi Yedei Chayva, or is that not required? The machlokes Rav Yehuda Reb Shimon is, what is the nature of Maseh HaOdam? Not mitzvahs or averis, but rather Maseh HaOdam. Moiser HaOdam min haBehema. What defines humankind? With what is a human being different, superior to all the other creatures in the animal kingdom? What is unique about man? It is his mind, his thoughts. Whatever a person does is saif masa b'machshava techilo. And therefore, when a person performs an act without intention to achieve a result, according to Reb Shimon, it is not defined as Maseh HaOdam. And this fundamental principle, obviously, in the eyes of the Rishonim, was so poshut that they saw no need to explain. Where do we first find this simple explanation? Dovesh yem eschaven. Why is it mutar? HaRav, Teferes Yisrael, Perek Mem Aleph. So the Maharal was a Suffolk Makubal Suffolk philosopher. It's impossible to define the Maharal. He is unique, stands apart. The Maharal in his writings insists, I'm not a philosopher. I'm against philosophy. The Maharal insists he's a Kabbalah. But his language is not the language of the Kabbalah. It's the language of the philosophers. The concepts he presents are not the same concept as the Kabbalah. So the Maharal was unique. impossible clearly to define. He was one of the greatest giants in Machshavas Yisrael, in Jewish Kabbalah and philosophy. So the Maral and Teferes Yisrael Perek, it's not a halachic discussion. But in the Torah of the Maral, everything comes together. Lamdas and halacha and philosophy and Kabbalah, everything comes together in a beautiful psifas. So the Maral and Teferes Yisrael Perek Mamalav speaks about the nature of Masay Odom. And the Maral says, Kol poyel mikri einoi poyel ha'odom. Something that is coincidental is not the nature of human acts or deeds. And that is why Dov Hashem is Chaven Mutar. So the Maral is Mavliya. He doesn't deal with the sugya of Dov Hashem is Chaven. He just brings it Kiveder Chagav when he defines the nature of human actions and deeds. Rabbi Yosef Engel was one of the phenomenal Gedolim in recent generations. We grew up with Rabbi Yosef Engel. My late father was a Gevaldige Chassid of Rabbi Yosef Engel. He went to sleep with Rabbi Yosef Engel. He got up with Rabbi Yosef Engel. And our earliest memories as children is a lot associated with Rabbi Yosef Engel. And he was truly a phenomenal sage. Ein doim alei kemat. So on one of his magnificent form, in Asman Diuraisa, Klal Chov Daled, he brings an unbelievable source. And this is unique. That is the signature of Rabbi Yosef Engel. So in Yevomis Tzadik Vav Omid Beis, the Gemara tells a story. It's an Agadah. And the Gemara tells a story about Chachmi Yisrael that was sitting in a Beis Knesses Betverien, and they were arguing about Zoham Alistarin, about a question of Tumah V'Tahara, Ad Shekoru Sefer Torah B'Chamoson. And out of their rage and Ritcha D'Oraisa, Koru Sefer Torah, the Torah Sefer Torah. And the Gemara says, Koru Sal Kedata. Is it possible that great Tanuim, Torah Sefer Torah, Elo Ema, Ad Shenikra Sefer Torah B'Chamoson. They didn't tear a Sefer Torah. It happened that the Sefer Torah was torn. So what's the difference between Karu and Nikra? Rashi writes, Karu Sefer Torah B'Chamoson, Karu Mashma B'Chavana. Hayala aladas that the Tenuim tore a Sefer Torah with Chavana. Ela Ad Shenikra Sefer Torah. So the basic Engel points out that is the difference between Kavana and the Vashiyim Chavan. Karu mashma b'chavana. If they tore that Sefer Torah without intention, without Kavana, they didn't tear that Sefer Torah. Nikra, it transpired. So the Yosef Engel, I don't think he quotes the Maral, but this is an amazing source from a story from an Agadah of Deim Darfman Zayin of Yosef Engel. You know, to bring a source like this in a sugi of Dov Hashem Chaven, you gotta be Rabbi Yosef Engel. To tie in a Rashi in a story told that Yevomis Tzadik Vav Omid Beis. Karu, Chazal say it's impossible. How would we even imagine that the Tenuim Torah Sefer Torah? Karu Mashma B'Chavana, Ela Nikra Sefer Torah B'Chamoson. And the great Chazon Ish. If anybody compares to the Yosef Engel, totally different style. But I'm a Gevaldige Chassid of the Chazon Ish. My Talmidim know many times. I say my base medish and my Koil, the Chazon Ish was a Rishon. He was thrown 500, 600 years out of his natural surroundings that our generation should see, how it should learn. So the Chazon Ish Orach Chaim Simenu and Ois Aleph writes, Dovar Shenasa B'li Chavona Einoi Maseh Ha'odom. Whatever is done without intention cannot be defined as Maseh Ha'odom, because the nature of Maseh Odom is, as I quoted, Seif Ma'aseh B'Machshava Techila, and that is why Reb Shimon maintains Davar She'eino Mischaven Mutar. There is no yichus between the teitzot, between the ma'aseh and the person. If he did something without intention, it is as if it happened. That's the Maral, that's the Yosef Engel, that's the Chazon Ish. And B'derech Menadrochim, that's Rashi. But Rashi is an Agadat. Do we have any source in the Rishonim? Yes, we do. Not a Masechet Shabbos. Not dealing directly with the sugya of Dovish Yemes Chaven. But I think the concept is found in a Rosh. A Rosh Masechet Chulin, Daf Lamed Aleph. Very base Masechet Chulin Simen Ches. And I'm quoting the Lashon of the Rosh. So the Rosh doesn't deal with the sugya of Dovish Yemes Chaven, but rather with the question of Kavona B'Shchita. And that's a machlokes whether the person that just dropped a knife and the knife happened to shecht an animal, is that shchita kshera? And the Rosh writes, "Avalam noflo saken miyodoi b'loi kavona. Have kamoi sheim hoisu monachas ala koire v'hipilosoi haruach. V'loi karinem be'v'zovachto. V'ochalto kiven shelo neschavan shum davar." So if a person dropped a knife without kavona, it is as if that knife was on a table, on a log, on a rock, and the wind blew the knife and it shechted. So the Rosh is not dealing about Dovish Yemes Chaven, but rather about Kavonas HaShchita. But his words are eye-opening, and they're exactly the way the concept of the Dovish Yemes Chaven is understood by the Chazon Ish, by the Yosef Engel, by the Maran and Teferes Yisrael Perek Mem Aleph. If a person had no intention of using that knife, then it is as if the wind blew that knife and it fell and it shechted. If the Torah says one needs to be zoiveach, without kavana, lo mikra koyach gavra. It is not defined as masa hodom. That is what we find in Rosh. So these are the sources which I brought, not in Minchas Osher Shabbos Pei Daled, but rather in Minchas Osher Psochim Simen Lamed. There are two very important simonim in Minchas Osher Psochim, in which I discussed at great length, in depth, the concept of Dovish Yemes Chaven. So after we understand Dovish Yemes Chaven, why it's mutter, let us try to understand why Psik רישא is different and why Psik רישא is chayiv. Abaye v'rova da amri tervayu moider b'shemem de Psik רישא v'layomes shechayiv. So why is Psik רישא chayiv afal pi shu Dovish Yemes Chaven? Two different approaches, two different pshatim, two different drochim. One derech, in my opinion, would be to say, if it's a Psik רישא, then it's not a Dovish Yemes Chaven. If it's a Psik רישא, we assume he does have intention. But he says, I had no intention. Coming back to the sugya of Mitzvah Sichos Kavona, and in no way do I need to say that these two sugyas are associated one with the other. No. Don't mistakenly understand me that way. Mitzvah Sichos Kavona is a machlokes hameroim. Dovish Yemes Chaven is a machlokes tenoim. The only common denominator between these two sugyas that I mentioned before is that they're so fundamental that neither Chazal nor the Rishonim saw a need to explain. And just like the machlokes Dovish Yemes Chaven deals with the very essence of human actions, the machlokes Sichos Kavona deals with the very essence of mitzvahs. How do we define a mitzvah? But I do want to draw a certain comparison by Mitzvah Sichos Kavona, and that is a huge discussion which I only briefly mentioned. We have the concept of Kavona Keha. And I explained many times what the Chayodim is Machadish and the Mishnah Berurah quotes him in Simon Samach. By mitzvah sichas kavana, sometimes even the person isn't aware that he had kavanas mitzvah, but we say this is defined as kavanas mitzvah. Kavanas mitzvah is sibas asiyas adavorim. Why did you do this? So a person says a mitzvah natilas lulav, and he takes the lulav and he doesn't know him, and then he comes to ask the Rav, mamish, when I said the bracha and it was makayim the mitzvah, I thought about the tiyul that I had yesterday. I wasn't machaven to be makayim the mitzvah, and the Rav will tell him, no. Be calm. If you weren't mechavan Hashem mitzvah, there would be no reason that you would pick up this lulav. That is defined as kavanas mitzvah, and the Chazon Ish defines it as kavana keho. It is almost in the level of the subconscious. You thought about different things, but in a very fundamental way, you were mechavan Hashem mitzvah, because otherwise there would be no reason to do nanuim. So when it's a psik רישא, we assume that, bearing in mind the person knows that this is the outcome, probably he did have kavona, even though he thinks it's a davar she'ein eschaven. That would be one approach. This approach is reasonable if it's a psik רישא denichale. If it's a psik רישא denichale and he derives benefit and pleasure from the result, then we can fairly assume he might not be aware of it, but probably benivchei machshavoisov, he also had kavana to the result, because it is nichale. It is something he wants. It is something he benefits from. But if it's a psik רישא deloi nichale, there's no reason at all to assume that he had kavana. So the other approach to understand the concept of psik רישא chayav would be, when it's a psik רישא, there is no need for kavana. Why not? Two different drochim. So today we're dealing with dakus, with daken shebedaken. One approach would be, Chazal give a moshel, and the moshel is very significant and fundamental. A person is tearing off the head of a bird, severing the head. What do you say? I had no intention to kill this bird. Well, cutting off the head of a living creature equals killing. It's just different words. It's not two sides of the same kind, it's the coin. It's the same side of the same coin. This is just playing with words. Cutting off the head of a living creature equals killing that creature. And that is a davar hamischaven. It is not because we assume that you have direct intention to kill, but it is as if, because it is the same. It's impossible to cut off the head of a living creature without killing that animal, and therefore this is equals kavana. A different interpretation would be going back to the reason that Hashem Eschaven is mutar. So I quoted the Maral, the Yosef Engel, the Chazon Ish, and going all the way back to the Rosh. The Rosh Masechet Chulin Daf Lamed Aleph. What a person does without kavana is not misiachas to the person. So what links a person to the actions and deeds he performs is intention. But maybe there is more than one formula that would link a person to his actions. And maybe the hechreach, the fact that the result is predestined. Maybe the hechreach is also miyachas that they saw to the oisa hamaisim. And that would be a different interpretation why psik רישא is chayiv. Not because we assume he has intention, Not because cutting off the head and killing an animal is one and the same, but rather, who says the only formula that links a person to his actions is kavanah? Maybe there's another formula as well, and that is echreach. When a person does A, and A necessarily, naturally causes B, then the fact that A must bring about B, that is enough to link the person to B and not only to A. And that is how we define psik רישא. If it's a psik רישא and the result is predestined, then the hechrech in itself ties that result to the person that did A, because A equals B. And that is why Komas Chaven LaA is as if he is Mechaven to B. So these are different formulas to understand why psik רישא is chayiv. Is it because we assume psik רישא is it over Mechaven, or is it because psik רישא equals the Mechaven? Either because two sides of the same coin are just the same, or is the hechrech ties a person to the result of his actions, just like kavanah would tie a person and link him to the result of his actions. My understanding of the shita oruch kederech harashoino. The oruch maintains that the reason psik רישא is chayiv is because we assume he did have kavanah. He might not be aware of the fact that he has kavanah, but he did have kavanah. And that is totally unreasonable unless it is a psik רישא denichale. V'kama hadvorim smeichim u'meirim. It is actually mefurish in the Rosh. Shabbos daf kuf chav in the suga gram kibui perek tezay in siman ches in Rosh. And I am quoting the Rosh when the Rosh brings the Oruch. Psik רישא Eloheicha denichale ba'odan sahadi b'kumechaven the ikala meimar anan sahadi b'kumechaven. Because the person is aware that the result is predestined, and it is a result that he wants. It is a result denichale. If it's a psik רישא denichale, anan sahadi b'kumechaven. So in my Sefer in Shabbos Pei Dala, they also emphasize the Lashon of the Rambam, even though I don't think it's a hechrech in the Lashon of the Rambam. So the Rambam, Perek Aleph, Halacha Vov, when the Rambam writes the concept of psik רישא, and I quote the Lashon of the Rambam, Osa masa v'nasas b'glora malocha shevadei teyosa b'shvelo yisay ma'isa. Nasas b'glora malocha shevadei teyosa b'shvelo yisay ma'isa aval b'shelo nischav l'chayev. Shadova yadua sheyefshe shaloi teyosa oisa hamalocha. So what does the Rambam mean when he adds on Shadova yadua sheyefshe shaloi teyosa oisa hamalocha? So when I wrote Minchas Osha and Shabbos, and that goes back many, many, many years, my understanding in the Rambam was Shadova yadua sheyefshe shaloi teyosa hamalocha. To whom is it yadua? To the person that does the malacha, and therefore we assume it is his kavanah. But I don't think so. When I go over the Lashon Rambam again, I am more familiar today with the Lashonos of the Rambam than I was many years ago when I was a younger man. I think I wrote the Sefer on Shabbos Tavshin Mem Ches or Tavshin Mem Tes. That's many years ago. I think Rambam writes Adova Yadua Sheyefshe Shaloi Teyosa Oisa Hamalocha. It doesn't mean that the person is aware. It means that we are aware. It is predestined. We know that it must happen. So I don't think this is necessarily Pshat in the Rambam, but I do think it's Mefurish in Rosh. לפרש האורך דרב שמעון לא מחי ובפסיקה שדניח עלי, איקל המימר, ענן סהדי דכל מחד. And all the other Rishonim that are chaylik on the Aruch, and they maintain Psik רישא is a Psik רישא with a nichalei or no nichalei. Their interpretation of Psik רישא is not anan sahada de nichalei, no. But rather, the second mahalach I explained in Psik רישא. When the result is predestined and there's no other way to do A without doing B, then A and B become the same. Cutting off a head equals killing. It equals natilas neshama. So one cannot say, I didn't want to kill, I just wanted to cut off the head. Because cutting off the head and killing is one and the same. Or the other knach I suggested, if A must bring about B, then there is no need for intention to link the result to the person. Dai behechoreach yaches teitzoah le'odam she'oise es hamais. And if that is no difference between Psik רישא denichalei and Psik רישא deloi nichalei, every Psik רישא should be higher. And the only reason to be maker of Psik רישא denichalei, it is because it is the malacha she'ein tzricha leguf. So Rashi, Zvachim Tzadik Aleph maintains, when the Gemara asks, Mezalfen mayim al gabe hu ishim, you're allowed to sprinkle water on the Mizbeach, and the Gemara says, well, there is a lav. You're not allowed to be mechabe eisha marocha. And the Gemara says, Dov Hashem escham, and the Gemara says, Psik רישא. And the Gemara says, he's mezalef, he sprinkles very little droplets. Rashi says, because yochal zalav betipas dakois, even though it's not little droplets, it's not defined as a Psik רישא. So Rashi's understanding is, even though the way he performs the malacha l'maisa b'foil, it is a Psik רישא. But if he could achieve, he could do the same maisa without having it be a Psik רישא, it is not defined as a Psik רישא. But Rashi is a yochid b'rishonim with that chiddush. Other rishonim maintain it would always depend. If it's a Psik רישא, it's a Psik רישא. And this is another pluk that I will explain based on the different interpretations. If we say A and B are the same, it is only if A and B are always the same. Whenever you cut off the head of a living creature, you're bringing about the immediate death, demise of that creature. And that is why Psik רישא is chayev. But sprinkling water on Galei HaMizbeach is not always bringing forth kibui. And therefore, we cannot say that Ziluf Mayim and kibui are the same. They're not intrinsically the same, because there's a possibility to be mezalaf mayim al gabe mizbeach without causing kibui. That is Rashi's understanding. So in my svor, both in Psochim, Simachov, Tes, and Simanamad, and Shabbos, and Pei Daled, I try to explain different shittas and different pluktas and different shilas in the sugya of Psik רישא based on the various different interpretations of Pshotim that I suggested be a Soida Dinsh of Psik רישא. For instance, very well-known machlokes between the Turazov and Rabbi Kiva, Turazov and Orachaim Melchas Shabbos, Rabbi Kiva and Melchas Basa B'Cholov, Kachi Darka Shel Torah, Aniyim B'Mokam Echad V'Ashirim B'Mokam Achar. What is the din of a Suffolk Psik רישא? But unlike Dov Hashem Eschaven, in which the suffix is a suffix la'osid, we're dealing with the suffix l'sha'avar. Person is closing a drawer, and there might be flies in that drawer. He's closing a door. There might be an animal in the room. He's not aware. Does that suffix render the Maisa Dov Hashem Eschaven? Or is that a psikration? You don't know whether there's a deer in the house. But if there's a deer in the house, then it's a Sveika Diuraisa. The Turazov and Shinta Zayim maintains, as long as there's a suffix, it's not a psikration. So Dov Hashem Eschaven and Smuto. Rabbi Kivegas and Pei Zayin and Bosa Bachora disagrees. And Rabbi Kivegas says, well, if you don't know whether it's a psikration or not, it's a Sveika Diuraisa. But it is a psikration. The difference between psikration and Dov Hashem Eschaven, according to the Bikivega, is Gorer Odam Kisei Mite Vesavsa. You're dragging a bench in the sand. You're grabbing a bench on earth. You don't know. You might be making an impression. You might not be making an impression. Depends how hard the earth is. That is a Dov Hashem Eschaven because the result is unknown. But when your suffix is l'sha'avar, according to the Bikivega, Sveika Diurais. The Taz says, still a Dov Hashem Eschaven. So once again, if we say Psikreisha is chayiv because anan sehadi dekumachaven, I think the Taz is right. If the result is unknown to the person, then we can't say anan sehadi dekumachaven. But if our understanding of Psikreisha is A equals B, and A and B are the same, then I think Rebbe Kivega would be more reasonable. So when you learn the sugyas of Dov Hashem Eschaven and Psikreisha, I think the asaidas I discussed today are essential. They're very, very important. Number one, what's the head of Dov Hashem Eschaven? So I am amazed that I haven't seen this Yesoid explicitly in any of the great Achroinim. Yes, I quoted the Rebbe Yosef Engel, I quoted the Maral, I quoted the Chazon Ish, but those are just sparks, sparks that are gone in an instant. I haven't seen any of the great Gedolim to ask this fundamental question and make a sugya out of it. So this is my basic approach in many sugyas and shas. When we wonder, why doesn't any one of the great Rishonim explain something? The only reasonable answer would be, it must be something extremely yesodistic, extremely fundamental, so fundamental, and so yesodistic that the Rishonim, with their infinite wisdom and insight and profound amkus, didn't occur to them that they need to explain such simple things. And that is my approach regarding the machlekes, this is Sichas Kavana machlekes Amaroim, and the machlekes of Reb Shimon regarding Dov Hashem Eschaven. So Dov Hashem Eschaven is not defined as Maseh HaAdam, because what is unique about Maseh HaAdam and what sets him apart from all the other creatures in the world, it's Surei Kedem, Shebora HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Maaseh Bereishis, is his mind and his intention. And therefore, Dov Hashem Shaloi B'Chavona, Einoi Maseh HaAdam, as I quoted. And this brings us to 2 or maybe 3 different pshotim. Why is Psikreisha different? The understanding of the Orach is Psikreisha Anan Sahavi Denichalei, Anan Sahavi Dekumachaven, and that is only Psikreisha Denichalei. The Kloiser Magereba was a giant, unique in many ways. He was truly a giant that walked amongst us in Torah, in Avodah, in caring for Klal Yisrael. So I want to speak primarily about what I saw with my eyes and what I experienced. we moved to Kiryat Sanz in Netanya 3 days before my bar mitzvah. And all my Bochel Shion, I learned by the Kloisim Magarevi. And of the many Gedolim I came to know throughout the years, and I had a close relationship with almost all the Gedolim during my lifetime, starting with Rav Moshe and Rabbi Yankov Kamenetsky. I had a especially close kesher with Rabbi Yankov, but I knew Rav Moshe. And Gedolei Eretz Yisrael, Reb Shimon Zalman. I had a very close relationship with Rav Yosef. Many times he turned to me and he asked me to write shuvas, and he relied on my psukim. I had a very, very close and unique relationship with Yeres Shachar, with Rav Alex Steinman, as Rabbi Gottesman knows very well. I accompanied him on some of his trips abroad, to Toronto, to Chicago, to New York, to Los Angeles. I knew most of the Gedolim during my lifetime, but my Rebbe Muvat was the Divrei Yatzif. So I want to share with you what I saw, what I experienced, but one can't tell the story of the Kloisim Rebbe without starting in the Holocaust, because it is then and there that he rose to the heights of Malachi Eshelis. Many times I told the story my father first met the Kloisim Rebbe. It was the second day Shavuos Tafshin Dalet 1944. My father arrived in Auschwitz the first day Shavuos, and that very same day he lost his Zayda, his Baba, his father, his mother, and 5 of his siblings, who went up in smoke in the chimneys of Auschwitz. One day later, the Kloisim Rebbe arrived, and he lost most of his family. And my father approached the Kloisim Rebbe, and he expressed his chus to try to become closer to the Rebbe and help him out as much as he can. Those 13 or 14 months in Auschwitz, from Auschwitz to Warsaw, from Warsaw to Dachau, from Dachau to Tutsi, till the liberation. The Kloisim Rebbe, throughout this ordeal, kept his kedusha, and he didn't eat cooked food. So all they had to eat is a piece of awful bread and some awful drink that they called coffee in the morning, and then a horrific soup with meat. When they came back from work, and that was Bosan Avelis Atzreifis, and the Kloisim Rebbe used to swap his soup for a piece of bread or a raw piece of potato. He paskined to everyone, eat whatever you have or whatever you could eat, because it's pikuach nefesh. But for himself, he was machmir. When he worked, and he worked just like all the others, because to the Nazis, there was no difference between the greatest gadol and the simpleton. To them, we were all vermin, less than vermin. Yemach shemam v'zichro. And when the Kloisim Rebbe used to work, avodas berach, svasoisav merach eshois, and somebody bent down and put his ear very close to the Rebbe's mouth, and he realized that he's quoting the posuk Tachas asher lo yovadetu es Hashem elokecho b'simcha v'b'tuv leivo. And that posuk was shogar al Shonoi all the time. Tachas asher lo yovadetu es Hashem elokecho b'simcha v'b'tuv leivo. Many years later, in a private conversation I once had with the Rebbe, he said, not for one moment was I maharer achrei meidosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when I heard those words, I shuddered. I just couldn't believe that a human being going through this Gehenna, leaving his wife, losing his wife and 11 children, his entire family, all he had, his wife and 11 children. For one moment, didn't I question HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when the Mishnah says in Masechet Tovos Perek, Yasor Nisyonis Nisnas Avrom Avinu V'Omed B'Kulam, Rashi writes, V'lo hirher achrei midosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the madrega of Avrom Avinu, and that was the madrega of the Kloisem B'Gerem. The moment of liberation, everybody tried to get back to life, and even many Gedolim. The initial response was just to care for themselves, to try to get away, try to escape, try to run away from this nightmare. Not the Kloisem B'Gerem. From the first moment, he dedicated every fiber of his soul and being to rebuild Klal Yisrael. So the Rebbe turned to my father and he said, I want you to help me build. My father was a young boy. He was 19 at the time, and he said, I want to learn. My father was a tremendous Ilui. And my father told the Rebbe, I need to learn. I want to go back to yeshiva. I want to go back to the Gemara. And the Rebbe angrily told him, you know nothing about Mesilas Nefesh. When one deprives himself from food, from drinks, from sleep, the Rebbe said, that's Mesilas Aguf. It's not Mesilas Nefesh. Verklappen the Gemara for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's Mesilas Nefesh. Closing the Gemara for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that is Mesilas Nefesh. Close the Gemara, my father did. And together with his great Rebbe, they built. In Fellenwald and Feldafing, establishing schools, chadorim, for boys, for girls, yeshivas, lekarav levi yisrael elavim shebashamayim. The Rebbe was the shadchan in Fellenwald. He was the shadchan of my father and mother, and he was their Masada Kiddushin in Fellenwald. My oldest brother was born in Germany, in Fellenwald. And the Rebbe built. To close the Gemara for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's sake, that is the greatest Mesilas Nefesh. The Kloisem B'Gerem was the greatest Ilui I knew. And my father was a tremendous Ilui. But that was a time to save and to salvage and to build. Many, many years ago, I don't recall when it was, I was invited by the Aguda to a convention to speak about the Kloisem B'Gerem. Maybe it was even the first Yortzeit. It's 26 years since the Rebbe passed away, Tavshin Nun Daled. I think it was the first convention after the Rebbe passed away. And I was invited to speak Motzei Shabbos, speak about my Rebbe and to share some stories and thoughts. I told a story that happened the first Erev Yom Kippur after the liberation. So Atzadik HaKadosh is sitting in his room preparing for Yom Kippur, and there's a knock on the door. The Rebbe opens the door, and there's a young girl standing there and crying, and she says, I remember every year Erev Yom Kippur, my father used to bench me, but my father is no longer. So I came to ask the Rebbe to bench me. The Rebbe took a handkerchief, spread it on that little girl's head, put her hands on her head, and benched her. She left his room with a smile on her face. A few minutes later, there's another knock on the door, and another, and another. 85 girls stood in line, and the Rebbe patiently spread that handkerchief on the head of each and every one of them and benched them like a father benches his children. I never knew a person that had 85 daughters, but Klozim the Rebbe had many more than 85 sons and daughters. He was the father to hundreds and to thousands that he brought tachas kanfei Ashkina with love, with compassion, with caring. And he took care of all their needs. So that's briefly the story of the Klozim Rebbe in the Holocaust and its aftermath. But I want to share with you about the godless of the Klozim Rebbe. First of all, is godless b'Torah. I don't think ever since the Divrei Chaim, the Hasidic Rebbe, achieved the renown and the fame as a Gadol b'Torah like the Klozim Rebbe did. Many Hasidic masters were great Gedolim. Starting off the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, Meir Nesivim, Menorah HaTorah. Those were Gedolei Yisrael Talmidim of the great Maggid of Mezrich. The Chidush Harim was an unbelievable Charaf and one of the greatest Gedolim of his time. The Avnei Nezer. But I don't think any Hasidic Rebbe achieved the status of a Posek Hador like the Divrei Chaim in his day and age. The Divrei Chaim, together with the Shoel Meishan and Reb Shlomo Kluger, were Poskei Hador, and every major halachic controversy of that era find its way into the Tshuvas Divrei Chaim, like the Shoel Meishan and Reb Shlomo Kluger. And his great-grandson, the Divrei Yatzev, was the same. He was known as one of the greatest Gedolei Yisrael of our time. And the crown of his Torah activities was the Shalos Tshuvas Divrei Yatzev. He was a Gevaldige Mefalko. Never in the history of Chassidus was there a Rebbe that said a pilpul at the Tish Friday night, not even the Divrei Chaim. That is a minig unique to the Klozim Rebbe, and I think it's symbolic. So I remember the days going back more than 50 years. There weren't thousands of Hasidim by the Tish, not even hundreds. Sometimes there were 20 or 30 people there. That's all they were. 2 o'clock in the morning, the Rebbe says a pilpul that takes an hour. It's embarrassing to say, but almost everybody slept. My father was one of the only people that never slept. He was really into it. And the Klozim Rebbe insisted on saying that shtetl every Friday night. I think he wanted to convey a message that the Klozim Rebbe Torah, capitalist. Chassidus is Torah, Avodah is Torah, Yiras Shamayim is Torah, Avos Hashem is Torah. Torah reigns supreme. But he saw as most important the Tshuvas that he wrote, 7 volumes of Divrei Yatzev. And in his short introduction to Shalos Tshuvas Divrei Yatzev, the Rebbe tells the story when he was a young boy sitting in his father's lap. His father was the Rudnik HaRav, a grandson of the Divrei Chaim. He was an awesome tzaddik. And his father told him, "You're going to be big. You're going to write a sefer. I want you to call the sefer Divrei Yatzev." Yatzev is Yekosir Yehuda ben Tzvi, the name of the great Klozim Rebbe and his father. And then the Rebbe says when he visited the Ostrovtzer Rebbe, he held himself a Talmud of the Ostrovtzer. The Ostrovtzer was an unbelievable Goyen and tzaddik. The Ostrovtzer Rebbe told him, like a prophecy, "You're going to be big, you're going to write Tshuvas La'alacha, B'To'eles Klal Yisrael." What is unique about the Tshuvas Divrei Yatzev is every Tshuva starts with a Gemara. And that is so important, such an important lesson. Because many Meiros today start off with Sifik and Surim, many Tshuvas start off with the Mishnah Berurah. Every tshuva in Divrei Yatzav starts with the Gemara. That's where it all comes from. That's where it all originates. Everything starts with the Gemara. That's an important lesson he tried to teach. And his Dveikis and Torah's Avos Torah was unbelievable. This is a story I told many times because I witnessed that story. I was there. So once a week, the Rebbe said a shiur clothing for the entire yeshiva, but every day there was a private shiur, only to a small group of bochaim. And for years, I had the source to be one of that. And I remember once the shiur was exceptionally short. It was about 45 minutes. This year, it became obvious to everyone why the shiur was so short. We were still sitting in the Rebbe's room when a person walked in. And I knew that person very well. He was a big nugget, a big tamchen diuraisa. He was very close to the Rebbe. So as it became obvious, a few days earlier, the Rebbe asked him, I want you to come to see me Tuesday, 8 o'clock. I have something very important to talk to you about. And the person objected and he said, it's impossible because I need to catch a flight 12 o'clock. And by the closing of the Rebbe, everybody knew that 8 could be 9, it could be 9:30. Zmanim were not very consistent by the closing of the Rebbe. So he apologized. And the Rebbe said, no, I promise, 8 o'clock, I'll be waiting for you. Person arrives at 8 o'clock, turns to the Gabbai. I have an appointment with the Rebbe, could you let me in? And the Gabbai says, well, he's in the middle of a shiur. So he asks, when did he start the shiur? He says, 7:45. 7:45? How long does the shiur take? He says, an hour and a half, so probably by 9:30, 9:15, I'll be finished. And the person was shocked. Did the Rebbe forget that I need to catch a flight? And he promised to be waiting for me at 8 o'clock. So the shiur was exceptionally short. At about 8:25, the shiur was over. And the person walks in and the Rebbe apologizes and he says, I did not forget. I didn't forget. We have an appointment at 8, but this afternoon I had an awful headache. It was unbearable. I took medicine and it didn't help. Chogemeintich gai starben. Because the Rebbe always expressed himself in exaggerated terms. That was his sprach. I thought I'm going to die. I had no option, no other choice but to call the Bochum in to learn with them. And we saw that on a daily basis. When he learned Torah, he got koiches loy ma'alam al-hudain, koiches l'ma'alam derech hateva. He forgot about all his pain and all his suffering. They all just evaporated. Ka'ari, his nasai, and the moment he finished the sheet, he just fell apart. That was the close of Rebbe and his dveikis and Torah, and his love of B'nai Torah. Like the Gemara says about Yechezkiyahu HaMelech. Let me share with you another story. So there was a person living in Kiryat Sanz. He worked in the girls' school. He wasn't a chassid. And 2 of his sons-in-law came for Shabbos, and they came to visit the Kleis of Rebbe. 2 Litvishin Galait that learned in Brisk, and the Rebbe talked with them and learning, and he was very inspired. He was very inspired, and he asked them, what's their parnasa? And they said, well, we get from the koilon, and everybody knows in Brisk we don't give much money. And the Rebbe was inspired. And then by Chumash Rashi was the Rebbe's platform where he spoke about the Yonah, the Yoim, and Divrei Musa. And I'll never forget that Shmus Chumash Rashi. The Rebbe said, 2 Yengalite came to visit me. Brisk Yengalite, Talmidei Chachomim Meflogim. And there Mekayim Divrei Chazal, Pas b'melech Toichal, Mayim b'mesura Tishta. I don't need your Shtreimlach, he said. I don't need your Shtreimlach. You could throw away your Shtreimlach. What I need is Mesiras Nefesh for Torah. Believe me, he needed the Shtreimlach very much. He was makbed and minig avos kekutzoi shel Yud. And a Chassidus Shelavish meant a great deal to him. But Torah meant 1,000 times more. and he gives meant 1,000,000 times more than a time. Doesn't shira. And I say, and his tefillah was unique. Our generation saw nothing like it. He davened like the Devar Chaim, like Rebbe Kiva. Brochas Lamed Aleph, the Gemara says about Rebbe Kiva, Manicha Yodem Bezovezu, V'matzah Bezoves Acheres. His tefillahs were unlike any other. He davened for hours every day. Every Shmoyne Esrei was b'demois sholish. In the middle of Shmoyne Esrei, he spoke to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Yiddish. Tate crying, he used to say 10 times. Keben ha-meschata b'fnei Yovev. Mamish keben ha-meschata b'fnei Yovev. You could never figure out how long that tefillah will take. Alavai, I should daven once in my lifetime, the Leil Kol Nidrei, the way he davened every Vochadik Mincha, every Marav, always with priyas. There's a story told that when he was a younger Rav in Klosenberg in Hungary, and in Hungary, it was the custom whenever a Rav visited town, first he came to visit the local Rav, the Moradasa. So it was told that the Minchas Alazah, the Munkach Rav, once came to visit Klosenberg, and he sent his Gabbai to check with the Klosenberg Rav whether he could come visit, and the Gabbai comes back and he says he's in the middle of Shabbos. So the Munkach Rav tells him, go check where he is in middle of Shabbos, you tell me. So he went back and he comes back to the Munkach Rav and he says, he's by Vayavorach David. And the Minchas Alazah asks him, go check, is it Vayavorach or David? That's a joke, but yes, Vayavorach is not the same as David. That's the way he davened. Sometimes the Shachas could take 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And you could never guess where he's going to cry and where he's going to stop. His tefillahs were Keben ha-meschata b'fnei Yovev. And when I come to think of it, this Goen v'kodosh, Tzadik Yesod Olam, whose entire life was Torah and Avodah. And he built a hospital. And he established Kiryot. He built the Yishuv in Netanya and a Vishuv in Yerushalayim. And these endeavors are time consuming. Today we have Ma'ane HaYeshua and B'nai Barak, but at the time it was unknown. Nobody understood. A Rebbe building a hospital, a Hasidic Rebbe, it's not a shtibel, because his devotion to Klal Yisrael was unlimited. His entire life was Mesiras Nefesh. For him, to close the Gemara was really Mesiras Nefesh. Shashua Shel Torah was what kept him going. That was his koyach, that was his sustenance, that was his life. Torah and avodah, Torah and tefillah. But if Klal Yisrael needs a hospital, he will build a hospital. His devotion to Tzarchei HaKlal knew no limit. Medrash Tanchuma, Rav Asi Lifnei Moshe was bitterly crying, and his Talmidim asked him, why are you crying? You weren't even Isaac B'tzorchet Siver. You were such a great maskman. And Rav Asi says, that is why I'm crying, because I wasn't Isaac B'tzorchet Siver. I wasn't Noisa Ba'ol Im Chaveirai. So the Kloisenberger Rebbe needed not to cry. He was not only a giant in Torah, a giant in Avodah. He was Noisa Ba'ol B'Chaveira V'Oisi B'Tzorchet Siver. And that is part of his unbelievable greatness. He should be a Melech Yosha for Klal Yisrael, and we should all try to emulate his ways. We should try to follow in his footsteps in Torah, in Avodah, in Tzarchei Tzibur. Should be a Melech Yosef of Klal Yisrael. We should only know B'Soros Tovis Yeshua's V'Nachomes. We should be Zocher B'Korav Tatchias HaMesim and be as Goel Tzedek and Binyan Beis HaMikdash B'Peiro Yomeinu.
Amen. Yeshkach, Kvayda Rav, and he's Zichrei Baruch. There'll be a Chazar Shir in today's Shir, and we will meet tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock for our Chana Shir for the week. And the Sugis of Rizchah. Thank you.
Both to all of you.
Thank you very much.